Welcome. Welcome. Thank you all for coming tonight. This is a very nice crowd to have, and I am especially happy that we have Professor Judy Gerson with us tonight. She is a professor of sociology and women's studies at Rutgers University, and for the past year, Dr. Gerson has been the Life Reborn Fellow for the Study of Displaced Persons at the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. She's received numerous awards, including the Lucius N. Littauer Foundation, the American Sociological Association, and the National Science Foundation to conduct her research on sociological perspectives of the life during and after the Holocaust. We're especially happy about the way that she got to us. We were having dinner with Dr. Gerson just before this talk, and we realized that it was a fairly well-extended network of scholars, feminist scholars, women that care about issues of inequality that brought Judy to us, and we lucked out because we piggybacked on her talk at Drake. So we're really happy to have her here tonight, and she's going to speak for about 45 minutes or so. We'll have time for questions afterwards, and thank you all, and Dr. Gerson.
Before I start, I want to express my thanks and my sincere gratitude to Cindy Anderson, to Leslie Bloom, to Pat Miller, to the Common Lectures program, as well as the Department of Sociology and the Women's Studies program. I feel really fortunate to be here, actually, and so thank you for coming. Also, before I forget, and I'll forget, I brought some material from the Holocaust Museum, all of which is slightly dated. We don't have updates. The budget is a little tight. But what I particularly want to draw your attention to, if there's any possibility, is that there are fellowships offered every year at the Holocaust Museum for people at all different levels of research and study, for people who are pre-doctorate, people who have been in their careers for 20 years. And I hope tonight somehow, even if the topic isn't exactly what you're interested in, that somehow I'll convey some of the enthusiasm and joy that I have for my subject, which is admittedly a very difficult subject. And if I'm to judge by the age of students, and not only my increasing age, there are also internships for undergraduates. So think about it. Just keep it in mind. The subject of my project is German Jewish refugees. And I want to start with a quote by an eminent historian, himself a German Jewish refugee, Peter Gay, who said, despite the volume of films, books, articles, exhibitions that we have on the Holocaust, we still do not know enough about those who survived, let alone those who died. And so my project actually focuses on survivors, people who lived through the tragedy. And it's understandable, I think, to anybody who stops to think about it for a second, why people who study genocide concentrate their efforts on people who were categorically murdered. Nonetheless, part of the study of genocide is a study of survivors, and it brings me to my topic. My project stands in contrast to public domain definitions of who a survivor is and who a Holocaust survivor is. Because public domain definitions, whether we want to talk about the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, or we want to talk about Yad Vashem, or the Shoah Foundation's definition, all of those public domain definitions are fully inclusive. They include as survivors anybody who in any way was affected by the Holocaust, who was displaced, whether it's from their home, economically, emotionally, anybody. And yet, the people whom I study don't think of themselves as survivors. They prefer the term refugee, immigrant. In the 1940s, they often would refer to themselves as newcomers. And I first learned about this distinction because I myself lumped everybody in one group. I first learned about this distinction as I was doing my first year of research at the Leo Baeck Institute, one of the archives I've used. And one of the volunteers, when I used the word survivor, said, and he continued to explain to me the distinction. And what Arthur Sandler said to me that day is that we, meaning the refugees and immigrants, reserve the term survivor as an honorific to honor those who survived in concentration camps, in forced labor, in hiding during the war. And so it is a matter of continuing to honor the different forms of suffering that distinguishes refugees, immigrants on the one hand, from whom they would call survivors on the other. As a sociologist, it's very important for me to appreciate how people understand themselves rather than formal definitions, and therefore I give priority to the definition people take on themselves. The people who are the focus of my project are people who fled Nazi Germany beginning on January 30th, 1933, and left sometime, the date after which Hitler was elected to power, and left before October 23rd, 1941, the date after which Nazis prohibited Jews from leaving the German territories. So the thing that you need to appreciate is during the first 8 years or so of the Third Reich, the government actually wanted the Jews to leave. But as you'll see as I go through the material, it's not as simple as that. The formal policy was one of trying to rid Germany of its Jews, but it was more complicated. I include people in my study, those who arrived in the U.S. before the end of World War II by Victory in Europe, which was May 8th, 1945. And so in that way, I'm not including people who came after the war as displaced persons, having survived in camps, in hiding, or in forced labor. It's an ethnographic project. I've interviewed people, I've listened to oral testimonies, I've read memoirs, letters. It's also an archival project. I've gone into the archives of refugee organizations, and I've also gone into the records of restitution files and claims. I'm really interested in what people would call daily life, people's lived experience in Germany, in their transition or in their transit to the U.S., and what their lives were like upon resettlement here in the States. And there are many ways I can talk about my project. Tonight I'm going to focus on the question of family and gender. And I think what I'll show you, although I welcome your challenges and criticisms, I think what I'm about to show you is that women and men were much more alike than different under these extraordinary times. To date, for social scientists in the room, I'll say that I've read 128 memoirs, most of them unpublished. I've listened to 23 oral histories. I've read 34 different files of correspondence. I've read the relevant essays to 2 essay contests. One sponsored by Harvard called My Life in Germany Before and After January 30th, 1933, and a second one sponsored by YIVO, the Yiddish Scientific Institute, called Why I Left Europe and What I Have Accomplished in America. In addition, there are governmental, what we would call classified reports of immigrants coming late to the U.S. in 41 and 42. And these are recently declassified documents in the National Archives in Maryland. And I've read 28 of those interviews. In general, I'm looking for what is the modal response. What's the most common pattern that I see in the memoirs, in the documents, in the letters? But I'm also interested in exceptions and contradictions, in outliers. 1 second. I know this will be redundant for those of you who have knowledge, but I feel like I should give some quick background. In 1933, the beginning year of the Third Reich, there were 525,000 Jews living in Germany, less than 1% of the population. Most of the Jews lived in the largest cities. About half lived in the 10 largest cities, and a third of the Jewish population lived in Berlin alone. During the 1930s, there was what people call an internal migration within Germany, as Jews moved from smaller towns to larger cities, thinking that it might be safer to live in larger cities because they could go less detected. They would stand out less. And so it increasingly became even a more urbanized population. I mentioned a moment ago that there were contradictory policies in the Third Reich about, on the one hand, they wanted the Jews to leave, and yet on the other hand, they had economic policies that made it increasingly difficult for them to leave. So that Jews were fired from jobs beginning in 1933, the first year of the Reich. They were let go in professional positions, in civil service jobs. They were taxed inordinately if they chose to emigrate. And the proportion of taxes, the percentage of taxes went up over the years. Beginning in 1933 and 1934, which I guess you know, looking at your faces, it was 25% of all assets were taxed that you had to pay the Reich before you left. The remaining 75% had to be put in a locked or set account that you did not have access to. By the end of the 1941 period, about 90% of people's assets were taken away from them. And so I think it's easy to imagine that regardless of people's income, regardless of people's assets, thinking about starting life over again without the assets, without the resources you had available to you, was for many people virtually unthinkable. That's the problem in Germany. On the U.S. side, there were also problems about coming into the country. The U.S., like many Western nations, had just gone through a major depression. And in 1930, President Hoover, before the Third Reich, before Hitler was elected, Hoover strengthened what we call the LPC clause, the likely to become a public charge, meaning would a potential immigrant need the support of the U.S. government, what we call welfare today? Would that person require support? And as a way to document that this person would never ask the U.S. government for federal monies to tide them over should they fall onto hard times, sponsors, usually people's relatives, but sometimes friends of friends of friends or third cousin once removed, wrote what we call affidavits of support. And in these affidavits, you had to list all your assets, show that you were a U.S. citizen, a person of good standing, and could, in the event of some catastrophe, help this person out. These affidavits had to be renewed if a person you were supporting couldn't leave Germany right away. They often required additional detail and evidence, so people went to credit bureaus to show that they really had the money in the bank that they had, even with a vice president of the bank writing on their behalf. What this procedure also meant is that it gave the consulates in Germany, the 3 consulates in Berlin, in Stuttgart, and in Hamburg, inordinate power to decide who would be a possible dependent on the federal government and who would not. And because the U.S. had just come out of this severe economic depression, what this meant, moreover, is that the consular officials, by and large, were really conservative, and they interpreted likely to become a public charges in any way possible. So unless a person could show through sponsor support that they were just going to be no trouble whatsoever, people were often denied admission. In addition, from the U.S. side of this, one second. We, beginning in 1924, had a quota-based immigration system, meaning it was country of origin. And the country of origin, the percent of people in the United States in 1924 determined the number of people who could enter each year. And even though the German quota was only filled once in the 1933 to 1941 period, it acted in people's minds, in the minds of German Jews, as a threat, because they thought the quota, they'll never get in. And it acted to dissuade many people from even applying during the early years. It's impossible for me to give you a 2-minute accurate sketch of German Jewish history. But the one thing that I want to point out for people who are fully unfamiliar is that the turning point in terms of immigration and wanting to get out of Germany for Jews was Kristallnacht, the November pogrom of 1938. It was on that night where, in a orchestrated series of events, synagogues were destroyed throughout Germany. Thousands of men over the age of 16 were rounded up and put into concentration camps. These were not yet death camps, but they were concentration camps. And so one of the questions that often comes to me is, well, why didn't the Jews leave earlier? They saw what was going on. And here's where it's difficult to give you an accurate portrayal of the history. But let me say that things were quite confusing, to say the least, so that there were differences throughout Germany, so that a measure might be announced such that all Jewish physicians had to stop treating non-Jewish patients, but it might be differentially enforced. Older Jewish people had lived through the rise and fall of different waves of anti-Semitism and had seen times getting better in recent years. And so they had reason to hope. They had lived through prior times that were bad, and they had reason to hope it would get better. Furthermore, Jewish men who had served disproportionately in high numbers in the military during World War I, and disproportionately had received medals of honor, the Iron Cross, other medals of honor. And so they thought, and I would say reasonably so, that they had just served their country. They had just served their nation state, and how could anyone do harm to them? It wasn't simply that these ideas come through the memoirs, but in fact, men who had served in the military with honor during World War I had privileges in the early years of the Third Reich. If they were civil servants, they could keep their jobs longer than other Jewish civil servants. If they had served with honor in World War I, their children could remain in school longer than other Jewish children. They could keep their houses or apartments longer than other Jews did. So it wasn't simply that people thought this. There were institutionalized practices that supported this. In fact, the references to World War I and military service are the single most frequent references that I see in the memoirs and the oral histories and the interviews I've conducted. And I think it goes to the question of being included in the state. Basically, Jews had been resident in Germany for centuries. And in fact, many German Jews, with the rise of Hitler, began to do genealogical projects where they traced their family trees back over the generations. And at first, when I started to read the memoirs, I thought, this is interesting, and I would take detailed notes. But it came up so often that I was not surprised when I began to read the German Jewish press at the time and noticed that there were a number of articles in these German Jewish newspapers that encouraged Jews in Germany to do their family trees, to trace their family trees. So libraries throughout Germany were filled during the early 1930s with German Jews trying to trace their ancestry. But the reason it becomes contested, much the same way service in World War I, is it has to do with a sense of feeling included. Basically, Jews became citizens state by state throughout Germany in the mid 19th century. And by the time Germany was unified in 1871, all Jews were citizens of the state. And so you can imagine that 60 years later, the sense that your citizenship did not convey the same rights as your Christian neighbors was a cause of great concern. And that concern was exacerbated when you recognized that Jews had disproportionately served their nation in World War I and did so with honor. And so again, what I took to be, an interesting social pattern really has an institutional base. Sorry for this. The memoirs are often addressed or acknowledged to be written for family members. When people open their memoirs, they often cite children, grandchildren, sometimes by name, as the reason they've written their memoirs. Mostly the memoirs are written retrospectively when people are in their 50s and 60s and 70s, sometimes their 80s. And the people writing the memoirs say that they feel that they want their children and grandchildren and their grandchildren's grandchildren to know something about what their lives were like. So in a sense, these memoirs are family affairs. The expressed audience are other family members. And maybe this helps explain why there's relatively little evidence in the memoirs I've read of increasing brutality, which I know from the secondary literature did exist. Maybe they were trying to protect their children, their grandchildren, from the worst of what they saw or knew or experienced. But it's also true that they may be protecting themselves. As you'll see in some of the memoirs I'll quote in a few minutes, the memories of the worst atrocities and the loss of kin, fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, friends is as painful 50 and 60 years later as they say it was when they first found out. But I don't want to give you the false impression that there's no discussion of the atrocities. Several of the men wrote about the roundup at Kristallnacht and talk about their experiences in the concentration camps. And I want to say very quickly something I should have mentioned a moment ago, which is over 2/3 of the memoirs are written by men. And this is interesting to somebody who understands that memoir writing in general tends to be women's writing. And here we have men writing, or disproportionately writing. So men occasionally, although rarely, talk about the atrocities. And just to give you an example, I'll read from Paul Nickelsberg's memoir, and he was one of the winners for the YIVO essay contest, which says something about what YIVO was interested in rewarding in these essays. And he writes about his time in Dachau and says, "In addition to the general excitement and anxiety, it produced fits of anguish and hysteria. People yelled and screamed and cursed at each other and tried to get out. Some suddenly came down with diarrhea. The police beat people back with sticks and knives. All hell broke loose, howling, blows, curses. Many soiled their garments. The stench inside was horrible. The barracks were frantic, and hysteria rose to a climax." There were other accounts like this, and I don't want to, in a sense, make this more difficult, and yet I don't want to protect you as well. But let me move on to the more common references. And one thing men did write about in great detail are the conditions under which they lost their jobs. There is no doubt that for middle class and often for lower middle class families, men were the primary wage earners in their families at that time. And so the loss of jobs threatened the well-being of the entire family. Men talked about being dismissed without notice at firms, small businesses where they had worked for 20, 30 years. Some men talked about how they read in the newspaper that that day would be their last day on the job. Shopkeepers lost customers. So even if you owned a small dry goods shop or you owned a small food store, you were threatened to lose customers. And yet other men talked about the loyalty of their customers. On April 1st, 1933, the first year of the Reich, Third Reich, there was a nationwide boycott against Jewish-owned businesses. And some people talked about its devastating effects, but more likely there were references how people's customers were loyal to them despite the threat of being arrested were they to be seen shopping at a Jewish store. But there is no doubt that the economics of people's lives, the loss of their livelihood, was an incentive to leave Germany. It's not to say that it was a fully rational economic decision, however. So let me read to you from Richard Offenbacher's memoir, where he says, "The conditions in Germany did not improve. The Nazis became more and more brutal, aggressive, and violent, and it was evident that the free world was standing idly by and doing nothing to stop Hitler. My dear father had died in 1937, so the time had come to think, well, prepare for emigration." Leo Grebler also talks about this, but he talks more explicitly about the difficulty of leaving his family. Grebler was a newspaper man and had thought he could retreat to the mountains and find safety there, and he couldn't, and he and his wife had moved temporarily to Switzerland. And Grebler writes, "In 1935, the notion of going to the United States was a little frightening to us. All of our families were still in Europe, although a few had left Germany. Stationing ourselves somewhere in Europe would make family meetings and contacts with friends easier." And finally, Joseph Adler expresses his anguish on having to leave his mother and sister, and he writes, "Can you do it? Have you the obligation to protect your mother, to hold her hand in the last moment of life? She was always understanding, always forgiving, and now I have to go to save my wife and children. The thought that I could not have saved my mother and my sister Bertha will torment me for the rest of my life." There are any number of memoirs, and sometimes I sit in the archives and I think I'm going to start to cry, and I think I'll start to cry right now, and I won't. But it's just very moving when you hear people's anguish over the difficulty of the decision, because this immigration was not intact families by and large being able to move. People usually came alone. Sometimes they came with a sister or a brother or a parent, but they usually did not come as intact families. Younger men had an easier time of it than older men. And young men in their late teens and early 20s, men who had just finished their formal studies, thought this might be an adventure. So even though we have a sense of tragedy looming over their lives, it's also true in the memoirs of young men, we see this sense of adventure. And so Alfred Meyer wrote that he thought of Frankfurt, where he lived, as almost a provincial city. And he looked forward to getting out and getting to the States and being on his own financially and economically and thinking about getting the rest of his family out. And he writes many years later, he didn't realize that the job of getting the rest of his family out would be a second job more important than his first job. In fact, many survivors and their sponsors talk about the work they did to get remaining relatives and friends out of Germany as a second job. I just finished reading the correspondence of the Kronfeld-Dykhoff family, who got one maternal aunt out and one cousin out in 1935 and 1941, respectively. And they're still working in 1941. And I spoke to the donor's son, who said he remembers his father just working all hours of the night, writing letters to senators and to congressional representatives, to writing letters to famous people, to going to the refugee organizations in various large cities to plead with them to do something for the relatives they had left behind. Sorry. There was a lot of work required of emigrants themselves, of the people leaving. The requirements of the government meant that people who planned to emigrate had to file papers in various bureaucratic agencies. They had to pay taxes that were, as I suggested earlier, quite significant. They had to make sure they did not leave any debt behind. And they had to get their papers in order, which was often a very complicated affair, because the papers meant securing a visa from the U.S. consulate, getting a passport, and by the mid-1930s, they were stateless. And although they could get a passport as a stateless resident, it wasn't easy. And they had to secure passage aboard a ship. And the sequence of getting all these papers in order was just an immense nightmare for people, because they might, for example, have secured a spot on a ship, but they don't yet have their visa. Or their visa, they have applied for a visa, but their visa number has not come up. And the ship sails. And so the coordination of paying the various agencies and letting the German government know by the required 2 weeks that they were planning to leave the country was just an enormous, not only burden, but just very complicated to actually pull off. They had to notify the local authorities 2 weeks before they would emigrate so that somebody could come by and inspect their belongings. Although they were only allowed by the mid-1930s to take the equivalent of 10 Reichsmarks with them, $4, they could take goods and possessions which they had used. But somebody had to inspect the packing list and make sure the packing list exactly matched the things that were about to be shipped. The reason I say there's very little discussion of this in the memoir is that as somebody interested in how people understand their own actions, it seems to me that the memoir writers erase or minimize their own agency in the work they had to do to leave. And on the one hand, when I read this or I notice its absence alongside multiple references to being on the last train, the last ship with a kosher kitchen, the last train to pass through the border with Holland without being stopped. There were many different versions of being last. Suggests to me that people, without saying it in these terms, see themselves as lucky. So they're not ascribing their own sense of getting out to work that they did or something deliberate that they did, but instead see themselves as fortunate and, in a sense, no different than those who were not able to escape. So what was it like when they first got to New York? In a sense, German Jewish refugees were not very different than other immigrants. They talk about their first impressions. We see a lot of references to the Statue of Liberty, to the first food that they had, the first sightings that they had of New York. Some people loved the skyscrapers and the enormous buildings. Other people describe them as a jumble and a morass, and it was horrible. Young kids could show off their knowledge of the United States and New York by knowing what was north and what was east and west, and loved telling other people that they understood where Fifth Avenue was and where the Bowery was. So there was some of that. But these are first impressions. And really what I'm interested in are what the first years were like. And here again, I came across something that surprised me. And that has to do with the emphasis on how non-problematic coming into this country and resettling was. And I want to quote two more dramatic examples of this. One was in an interview that I did. And I'm talking to this very intelligent woman in her late 70s, early 80s about what it was like her first years in New York. And she very politely stops me and she said, "I don't understand what you think the problem was. By Thanksgiving, we were all Americans." And although, I didn't believe it at the time, and nor do I believe it at this moment, but again, what's important to me is her perception that there was no problem. They just resumed their lives. They were Americans. And I want to quote from an oral history testimony that I've recently listened to at the museum by Elizabeth Modell, herself an artist, somebody who was a painter and did very well as a painter once she came to the States. And what she says is that I was adjusted immediately. This is her emphasis. I didn't have any trouble whatsoever. I felt at home immediately. I spoke English, and my husband spoke English. And my husband immediately had a job. And we immediately had friends. We were Americans. This is where we wanted to be. And again, I don't think this is literally true. And I'll go on to quote a later part of her interview. And this will be the clue. Of course it was terribly hard, but it was also wonderful to be in America. Nothing was bad. My husband immediately had a job. That was wonderful. I began to paint. But when the interviewer asked her about the life she left behind, she said, "Of course I lost my mother and all of them. It was tragic and terrible, but I don't want to talk about it." So on the one hand, I'm fully sympathetic about not wanting to talk about a painful past. But I think the pain of the past added to a sense of automatic possibility that they were Americans. It was a way to not deal with the past, that they could be in the present. I don't for a moment think that immigrants and survivors who lost kin, who themselves experienced brutality, ever forgot about it, and they for sure talked about it among themselves. But in any more public venue, whether it's in an interview situation or talking to people who are years younger than them, it's not a trusted audience, and I think understandably they find it hard to do. I want to just quickly turn to contemporaneous accounts. The memoirs, the letters, the diaries are usually retrospective accounts. And the recently declassified documents in the National Archives, what was the Coordinator of Information Services? Coordinator of Information Services in the 1940s was the precursor to the Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor to the CIA. So I say this just as a way to short circuit a lot of more technical information and say that this was intelligence gathering and intelligence reporting. What the coordinator of information services wanted to do is get information from immigrants arriving late. These are people coming between January 1941, June 1942. It's very late. Remember that, emigration gets closed down in Germany in October 1941. It's just very late. Increasingly, it's harder and harder to leave Germany after November 1938, the November Pogrom. And so these are rich and detailed reports. And what we see in these reports are that and I only have 28 of Jews coming from Germany, so don't overgeneralize. But the impression I get is that these people are much older than the people who came in the earlier part of the immigration. They are generally people who come with a spouse. So these are elderly Jews coming with a husband or wife. They're interviewed usually days after they get off the ship. And the interviewer has a coding scheme to rate them in terms of reliability, intelligence, willingness to cooperate. And what we see from these reports is that most people are very nervous to talk. And they're nervous to talk because they're afraid that if they say something and it'll get back to people in Germany, that their remaining kin, will be in even greater danger. And so there's a tension in these interviews between wanting to get information about daily life in Germany and what these people will say. We do know from these reports that food rations remain adequate in 1941 and early 1942, although elderly Jews talk quite often about the absence of white flour. And that's a question of digestion, so that brown flour, coarser flour, is harder to digest. And so, in a sense, elderly people are not getting sufficient nutrition. Although there are clothing rations for the non-Jewish German population, not for German Jews. So the one pair of shoes they have, and literally that's all people are allowed, is the one pair of shoes they have. There's a spool of thread rationed every month to people. But perhaps the most stunning part of this report deals with the morale of people in Germany. And what they report in 1941 and 1942 is that morale is decreasing. And the most, powerful indicator of this declining morale is that they report elderly Jews are no longer going to the air raid shelters when an air raid siren is sounded. They have just lost any sense of possibility. And this is in 1941, 1942. These are people before deportation. I want to talk just a bit more about family life in the States upon resettlement. And what I want to suggest is that a few things. First of all, men worked as hard as women to get remaining family members out. So this more conventional, contemporary definition, gendered definition of family life, where we assume or think or gather that women take primary responsibility in conventional terms for family life and men take primary responsibility for wage earning activities, was nowhere to be found in these memoirs. Women and men took what jobs were available to them, and they both saw it as necessary to not only support the families that were here in the States, but to save money to try and get their families out of Germany. Men worked as hard as women in going to refugee organizations, trying to elicit their help to get remaining family members out of Germany. Marian Kaplan, an eminent social historian of German Jewish life, has suggested, although it remains to be seen, and I promised I'd go back to the files, she thinks even though men disproportionately signed the letters to, for example, the National Council of Jewish Women or the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, both refugee organizations, or the American Friends Service Committee. She believes that men may have signed those letters, but women wrote them. And so I'm going to go back and look at the handwriting and try and figure this out. But I do want to give Marion Kaplan's conjecture its due. But there's no doubt to me in these memoirs, most of which, as I said, are written by men, that family is paramount in importance to them. And I just want to quote, not as proof, but to give you a flavor of the memoirs and how they talk about family once they come to the U.S. In a sense, there are many references to the joys and sorrows of family life. The joys being the birth of new generations of children, of finding relatives whom they thought were lost. The sorrows, as you can imagine, are people they find out were deported and killed in Europe, soldiers who were killed in World War II fighting for the U.S. military. There are many sorrows, but it's the family that's the locus of the strongest joys and strongest sorrows. And so let me just quote from one memoir. And the person writes, "We ate breakfast. The food which is eaten in its homes is an important feature of a country, as important as its climate and its language. Notice how it tastes, how it nourishes you, and you will learn important things about its geography. American food is rich and reflects the abundance of this country. My first drink of milk here was a sensation to me of creamy, sweet, smooth drink, and every time I have milk with my meals, I get the same enjoyment. Grandmother was sitting around the table beaming. She liked to have a big crowd around her table and plenty of food on it. She always has been used to a large family with 8 children. It was everyone's pleasure." This memoir is written by a man, and I think read out of context, if I forced you to choose, I think, or I at least would say a woman had written it. But it's not distinct. And so it brings me to what I want to highlight in my conclusions. That is, under extreme conditions which these refugees faced, and I do not want to equate them with survivors because they would not want to be equated with survivors, but their lives were difficult enough. Their pain and memory over not being able to get remaining kin out of Europe remain to their dying days, and if they're still living, it remains with them as a haunting memory. But it is about family. And I think that commitment to family, once they resettled in the United States, no matter what form those resettlements took, family remained primary. And so it leads me to think that under extreme conditions, women and men are even more alike each other than they are under daily life as we know it, most of us here today. So thanks a lot. I'm happy to take questions and comments.
I'm not a sociologist.
That's okay.
How much of what you're seeing here do you think has to do with Jewish culture?
Okay, and I didn't talk about it at all, and it's a great question, and so let me see if I can say it succinctly. There's a great variation in what it meant to be a German Jew. I know you know this, but so I'll point to people I imagine might not know it. The stereotype of German Jews is that they were more German than Jewish. It is a stereotype that's evident in the literature from the 18th century onward. And it's a debate that takes place in philosophy, in literature, in arts, in public discussions, in reading groups, and study groups. It's something that comes through again and again in many different forms. And so in a sense, people writing their memoirs often write against that stereotype. They're writing to complicate it, to say it's not that simple. And people write from a variety of positions. Some people are very observant Jews, and so they just think it's false. That stereotype is just wrong. But other people people might be more secular or less observant, and yet they think and they write in their memoirs, I am a Jew by belief, and I am a German by citizenship. And they say that in different kinds of ways, but it basically comes down to that formula that I can be both. And so there are a wide range of beliefs and various ways in which people adhere to the Jewish tradition. And it gets, of course, more complicated once they come to the States. Some people sustain their observance and their orthodoxy coming to the States, so they're Jews who happen to live in Germany before they immigrated, and now they're Jews who live in the States, whereas others lost their faith, saying and believing, how could a righteous God have done this or let this happen? And so it's really a complex and important question. And I'm not sure I've satisfied you.
Well, I'm thinking more in terms, not so much of Jewish religiosity. I'm from Eastern European tradition, but nothing surprises me about their family remembering meals, because that's Jewish culture. So that's kind of.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay.
So how much of what you're finding about the men had to say versus the women is because they were Jewish people? That's what I'm asking.
Right.
Culturally.
Right.
Forget the religious.
Right. Oh, that's an even tougher question.
Okay.
That's a question of attribution, right? It's like how do I know what's the Jewish part, what's the German part? And I want to say they're always there in tension. So if you think about multiple identities and how to think about various identities coming together, so not only am I, the person giving the lecture today, I'm somebody's friend, and so identities have different salience in different situations. And I know I'm answering it abstractly, and I'm not answering it empirically because I don't know the empirical answer. But it's a good question, and I'll think some more about it. Thanks. It's a really good question. A question I might be able to answer.
I think along those same lines, did you see that people who immigrated here went more toward the areas of the United States where the Jewish people were settled, or where perhaps in the Midwest where the primary ethnic background is German?
Right. A great question. Over 2/3 of the people emigrating in this period.
Who had a choice? I don't know.
Right. Well, right. So, and I'll get to the question of choice. Stayed in New York, okay? And this was against the best efforts, or despite the best efforts of refugee organizations, which worked tirelessly to get people to spread out throughout the U.S. Refugee organizations were very worried about rising anti-Semitism in the U.S. And they thought if Jewish refugees were to stay in New York, the concentration would lead to greater anti-Semitism. And as you know, the U.S. had just come out of a period of great depression, and people were worried about immigrants taking jobs away from native-born citizens. The same debates we have today, right? And again, so there were, for example, in New York City, the owner of Bloomingdale's says, I've only hired 2 Jewish refugees, although he gave lots of money for refugee causes. There are people saying, I'm only hiring so many. And people in this room may know that one of the efforts was through the American Friends Service. Yeah. And I haven't, done a lot of research, but so Scattergood, are people very knowledgeable and could speak rather than I about?
I don't know if there are any Quaker people here today, but the Quakers at Scattergood opened up their school for refugees, most of whom were Jewish, not all, and tried to orient them such that they could go out, and they did, go out into society. I'm a member, the board member of the Iowa Jewish Historical Society, and last year we had an exhibit in
I saw
Scattergood.
that on the web.
And, it's interesting first of all, that they took this initiative, and secondly, they really didn't know that much about Jews and Judaism, but they did their best to try to accommodate and enculturate these people into what they needed to do. It was an important transition thing, and they certainly were taking risks in doing this. And the fact that they did it in the middle of cornfields of Iowa is, I find, quite fascinating.
Right, absolutely. So what did they teach you? Language,
They taught them language. They taught them about American culture and jobs and gardening. Yes, and they did gardening, and most of these people, of course, came out of urban, as you pointed out of urban scenes. So they did know about gardening. They didn't know about livestock, and most of them did not go out on the farms, I might add. But there was this attempt to clue them in on American life.
Or similarly closer to where I live now, southern New Jersey had its chicken farmers who were German Jewish refugees, and some of them, not many, but some of them did remain chicken farmers for many decades. But there were similar settlements throughout the country where refugee organizations tried to get people to spread out.
Well, probably another reason why there were so many that stayed in the East is that they probably settled near the people providing them affidavits to get out. And there were more probably on the East Coast than in the Middle West.
That's true, but let me just also say that one thing people did, especially in Hamburg, where apparently because of the large shipping lines in Hamburg, Germany, there were a lot of U.S. telephone books available in the Hamburg Public Library. And what people would do in searching for sponsors, they often didn't know anybody in the U.S. And they'd go to the phone books of cities where there were large German-speaking populations and look up all the Perlmans. So they might go to Milwaukee, for example, and look up all the Perlmans. But you're absolutely right in suggesting that where your sponsors were often meant that you had a vested interest in staying nearby. Although, can I quickly add that not all sponsor relations ended happily ever after, as I think many of you can imagine.
I'm interested in what type of work the immigrants found. I mean, was it the same type of work they had done before?
Great question. No, not at all. Again, the stereotype of this wave is that they were largely professional, highly literate. Actually, when you look at the numbers, they were mainly small shopkeepers. Many of them had been horse traders and cattle traders and small business people. And so even there, for somebody who had been a small shopkeeper and had a small dry goods or small food store, when they came here, they became peddlers initially, full of brush salesmen, if that means anything. You're probably too young, sorry. Women inordinately became homemakers for other families and nannies, wet nurses, they were called. And professional men, it became a little more, or professional people became a little more complicated. So, for example, they were refugee agencies for physicians. They were refugee agencies for academics, for cantors and musicians. So several professional groups had a already standing organization from the States in English, and the people in Germany are writing in German.
And how do they know English well enough to do this writing? They grew up in Germany.
Okay, it's not easy enough to say, well, they had studied it in school, because they usually had not. But if you understand that a couple things happened in the Jewish community in Germany beginning in 1933 that worked at cross purposes. On the one hand, many Jewish leaders within Germany were encouraging their people to strengthen their ties to Germany and to hold strong within their communities. So there were a lot of activities to help them do that. For example, I'll just cite one. When Jews were no longer allowed to go to theater or concerts, Jews in Germany started their own cultural organization, which put on productions in major cities, musical, theater, poetry reading, so on and so forth. So on the one hand, we have the leadership encouraging people to stay put, but there are also emigration agencies, that are helping people prepare to leave, because they recognize that people are wanting to leave and there may be reasons. So there are mixed messages, to say the least, and language courses are starting all over the place. So people are studying English, people are studying the language. As things get tighter and tighter, people are studying Spanish. Shanghai, which is the place where you don't need a visa, and people have no language skills to speak of, are trying to learn some Chinese. So language skills.
I think this makes even more clear the difference between German Jews who are immigrating and Jews from shtetls and Russia and other places where they didn't have access to many of the social resources and educational institutions. And I'm curious if, I think it's very common within Jewish communities to be very aware of the conflicts between German Jews and Jews from other areas. German Jews were, from my non-German Jewish side, considered the upper class of Jews, the ones who had more, who looked down on the Jews from Russia and Eastern Europe, and we spoke Yiddish and they spoke German and English, right? So, but what I'm curious about is in the memoirs that you're reading, are you finding that German Jews, as they established themselves in this country, wanted to stay away from the Eastern European Jews who were considered the immigrants, and they were, the Europeans, kind of?
Right. Yes and no. Okay. So I'm just trying to think about how to respond. Give me 1 second. I want to say first something about the stereotype, and then I'll get to your question. There is the stereotype. People within the American Jewish community, I think, know it well, and it's still troubling to this day, right, in various ways. That said, as somebody who studies German Jews, what I want to say is that, and this goes to questions of inequality, it has to do in part, and I think this is what you meant when you talked about resources available in the shtetl. It had to do with the ways in which industrialization and economic development spread in Europe from west to east. So what that meant in effect is that Germany was more industrialized. It looked more modern than did Eastern Europe in the early decades of the 20th century. And so this sense of what we understand to be snobbishness is really in part about social class and about retaining the traditions of old world ways. But there's no doubt there has been tension between Jews of Eastern Europe and Jews of German descent, particularly in Europe, and particularly in the first decades of the 20th century. Okay, so that's your question, which I've now forgotten.
It had to do with, are you finding in the memoirs that people wanted to not associate with Eastern, because this is the fantasy, or that, I hear, it's as if, in the Eastern European family side, they wanted to be with the German Jews, but they wouldn't play bridge with them. Right. And, so I'm curious, when you're reading the German Jews,
so cleanly. One is that the refugee organizations help Jews no matter where they're from, and they don't discriminate. There's no evidence of discriminating German Jews, Eastern European Jews from the widest range of regions come to these refugee organizations in the States that are basically run by German and Eastern European Jews who have been in resident and been citizens for decades. So there's no discrimination there, okay? It is true that in the largest cities, German Jews often set up their own synagogues. Now, we could jump to the conclusion that means they're not getting along, but there's a different liturgical tradition in these communities. There's a different language of prayer, and there's a different, different prayer. I'm not going to get started, but the traditions, the religious traditions are different. So it makes sense in that way to keep those traditions alive here. But I think the most interesting part has to do with, okay, so what was daily life like? And did the people who came from Łódź in 1955, did they become best friends with the people from Berlin or Vienna? I think not. I think not. But I don't necessarily believe, therefore, it means that the tensions remain. So there are a couple of references in the memoirs where German Jews get jobs on the Lower East Side. And a former Russian Jew will say to the German Jew, I'm not doing this because your grandfather was nice to my grandfather, but I see you need help. So it's like they'll put it out there and then it's over. And I think probably that's what it was. But also, one would hope, somebody who was born after the war, one would hope that, after the war, given the categorical murder of Jews, of gypsies, of Jehovah's Witnesses,
They can get along with each other.
yeah, exactly. So I'm hoping.
It's something that people outside the Jewish community probably don't even know that there would be those kinds of conflicts within.
And that's okay.
Yeah. Maybe I shouldn't have spoken about that.
No,
Why? A good deal of my research has to do with intra-group diversity. And it's not just with Jews, it's with blacks, it's with Hispanics, Latino, whatever terms you want to use. But people, and I belong to the National Association for Ethnic Studies, and they're always looking at differences between groups, which is fine. So, my contribution is, okay, we know at that level. Let's start looking at intra-group differences, which are incredible in terms of Sephardic Jews, of Eastern Ashkenazi, Western Ashkenazi Jews. And I think a lot of this difference, not all, but I know because I grew up with these little things, not so little sometimes. But the German Jews, by and large, not all, were Reform or liberal in their practices. And the Eastern European Jews were, by and large, Orthodox. And tended to look at what Reform Jews were doing was assimilation. I hate that term.
Yeah.
I'm an anthropologist.
Right.
Maybe we can talk about
Yeah,
this.
no, we have to get rid of that
But
term.
the way people use that word assimilation is it's losing your culture. Well, first of all, cultures don't get lost, they change, in my opinion. And they can change radically. And people can convert and change their identities. Well, I'm just saying what I think. But a lot, I was talking to you beforehand. My wife's saying her aunt, were German Jews. They were raised in the Reformed tradition. I was flabbergasted when my mother-in-law showed me her father's tefillin, or phylacteries. They're the little amulets that Orthodox Jewish men traditionally wore when saying prayer. And I said, I thought you said your family was Reformed. And she said, we were, but in the town we lived, there were two synagogues. One was Orthodox, and one was more Orthodox. And he went to the one that was just Orthodox, because it was, you only had two acts in that town. But I think that the difference between Reform and Orthodox was important. And in these letters we're translating, I'm fascinated by the references to Judaism. I mean, these people had mezuzahs, the little amulets that you put things that related to their own Judaic identity. They weren't fleeing from that at all, but they weren't keeping kosher primarily. They weren't doing those things. So it's there are a lot of nuances, and I when you were giving your talk, I just sort of made a checklist of everything that we're working on right now.
Wow.
So I really enjoyed your presentation.
I'd like to thank Judy Garrison for coming tonight, and for all of you for coming also. I believe she's got a few minutes if anybody wants to touch base one-on-one with her. I don't want to keep her up too late tonight, but maybe a little bit. So thank you again, Judy.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you for coming.
No, great question.
I think it's interesting, the Scattergood School is in the birthplace of Hoover, West Branch, Iowa's bastion of Quaker life. And did you know also that the state of Iowa hosted numerous prisoner of war camps?
No. Oh, thanks. It was so great reading.
Numerous prisoner of war camps for German prisoners of war.
Didn't know that.
And many of these camps are I'm from North Central Iowa.
Yeah.
And they were in these little towns around North Central Iowa, and the people were used as farm laborers. And many of them attempted they were deported, but they attempted to come back. And some did. And there's a lot of study out there. And this fellow might be able to help you with that. But that's a very interesting thing. Iowa is very interesting about that. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for that comment. Thanks.
Yeah.
Actually, do you have time? Let me just quickly get my pen and take some. Okay. Actually, great. Oh, really? Okay.
Oh, yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
oh, okay. Okay. Thank you so much.
Oh, you could.
Okay. So, can you write? Oh, can you give hard? Some people
We're
are
friendly
organized.
people here, huh?
And you're here only 2 weeks. 2 months, sorry. Unfortunately, I'm leaving tomorrow morning. You're not coming to Washington during the time. Oh, hi. Hi. Lena.
So I just want to tell that just offer you is I'm interested it has something in common because I also studied narratives, but not all testimonies. But I studied written narratives that students
I
so I'm just interested in how collective memory Holocaust is constructed in Ukraine. And I have some comparative studies in other countries in different institutions such as textbooks, museums. So it's just
that's true. Yeah, we really, and I didn't talk in terms of collective memory, but that's obviously the framework.
Sure, and now I'm here and I'm enjoying just all the references and the articles and books about just difference in collective memory, cultural memory.
Right, right.
Because just it is what I'm working on.
And have you written some in English?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll look it up.
Yes,
I will.
I wrote, you can find my article just about students' essays on the Holocaust in the journal of Holocaust and Genocide.
Oh, I wondered about that.
It is
Okay.
2006.
Got it.
You'll find it.
Got it. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
No.
Because I enjoyed
Yeah.
it. It was great.
Well, it's great to meet you, and somehow I hope we get another chance.
Yes,
Yeah.
and please, if you need something from you, just
Okay. I will keep this. Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure meeting you as well. Okay.
I have to interrupt you because I have to go, but I'm driving you in the morning.
How
So
do you-
where do you want to meet me?
You tell me.
Do you know the hotel desk, like where
Yes,
you checked in?
yeah.
I'll meet you there.
Okay.
8 a.m.
Okay, that sounds great.
AM.
Okay, that sounds great.
AM.
Okay, that sounds great.
AM.
Okay, that